gonna start recording. So, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about creating responsive layouts with Sass, CSS Grid, and Flexbox. I'm just to start, I'm kind of assuming everyone here knows a little bit about front-end development and understands kind of what CSS is, and I assume kind of we all have that basic background. So, all right, here we go. So just as an overview of the presentation, I'm going to start by giving a brief explanation of each technology and its origins, just so we're all on the same page as to our understanding of what Sass, CSS Grid, and Flexbox are and what they accomplish. And then I'm going to give some general tips for creating responsive layouts. So just kind of broad advice for when you're starting out creating a layout, how to start and kind of how to think about it. And then a couple of tips to utilize Sass, CSS Grid, and Flexbox when you're building layouts. So more specific advice and some code snippets that I've found very helpful during my time in front-end development. And then I thought it'd be cool if I kind of showed just for building a layout from the ground up using these tools as I go and kind of show the code and how simple it is to set up a responsive layout. And yeah, so that's pretty much going to be the whole presentation. Shouldn't take too long. All right. So talk about Sass. So Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. And what it is, well, it was created in 2006 as a feature of the Haml markup language. Kind of an interesting fact. And then, so basically what it is CSS on steroids. It allows you to do everything you can do in CSS, but it allows you to keep your code a lot drier, and it provides you a bunch of tools that help you with development. So it's a CSS preprocessor that extends CSS with fun tools. So basically what CSS preprocessor means is that it eventually gets interpreted or compiled into CSS. So it provides a couple of things. It provides us access to variables that we can define. So that's one thing that keeps our CSS code a lot drier because we're able to define things like color variables or like standard widths or values that we'll use throughout a bunch of different component files. It provides nesting. So in normal CSS, you can pretty much only define one rule set for a targeted like div or whatever. But with this, you can kind of nest your rules so that it's everything you define is contextual and you can kind of see the layout in your style sheet. It provides us mix-ins, and what that allows us to do is kind of utilize common styles across different classes and things like that. So you can share styles very easily between things. And it provides some level of inheritance where you can extend other classes that you've defined. So that's kind of similar to mix-ins, but it can be useful. Just another thing to keep the code dry. And it provides a bunch of functions. And there's a bunch to go over. I'm not going to be going over all of this. This is just kind of an overview kind of thing. We're only really going to be talking about it as it relates to building responsive layouts. So that's Sass. Then we'll talk about Flexbox. So Flexbox was created to make aligning dynamic page elements simpler because for a long time, the standard was very hacky and you had to use things like floats and tables and just a lot of weird stuff um, that was very hacky, and it was hard to just center a div in the middle of a page. And with Flexbox, that's very easy. So it's a one-dimensional kind of tool, but it's direction agnostic. So you can define columns or rows and kind of define how the children of those columns and rows behave and how they fit to the screen. So it's really good for small scale layouts, not necessarily for defining your entire like page layout, but for something like controlling how things are displayed in a sidebar or in a top nav bar, or just anything that's only one dimensional. Flexbox is great for. Okay, and then CSS Grid. So CSS Grid is it's fairly new. A lot of people don't know about it or don't really use it, but it's based on the idea of a grid layout, if you can believe that. And it's the first two-dimensional layout system. So we talked about how Flexbox is kind of one-dimensional. You define a row or you define a column. With CSS Grid, you can actually define your entire page and how elements behave at a grid level. So it's really great for creating responsive layouts and kind of defining the entire layout of your page very simply. And it's had full major browser support since October 2017. We don't include Internet Explorer in that because that doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned. All right, so now some responsive layout tips. So when you're building a responsive layout, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. And these are just kind of tips that I've either found on the internet or figured out myself as I've built, a few layouts myself. So I always take a mobile first approach, and there's a couple reasons for this. It's best to start simple. So on a mobile layout is typically the simplest layout. It's the smallest screen. There's only so much content you can fit on it. And so defining that first is a good way to start, because once you start stretching that, you want to add more complexity as more screen space becomes available. And so typically if you define a mobile layout first and stretch that out, like it's still going to look fine. It's at bigger screen sizes. So yeah. On top of that, you want to target the major breakpoints for screen size. So the standard for that is phones, tablets, small laptops, and desktops. And each of those sizes are defined here. Yeah, so those are the major like screen sizes that you want to target and kind of determine how each of those, how you want your layout to look on each of those screens. And so you can use browser tools to test your layout on specific screen sizes. Like Chrome and Firefox have really great tools for this, where you can actually select specific devices. Like you can see how your layout looks on an iPhone X or on a Google Pixel or an iPad or whatever. So it's really great for when you're building these layouts. Okay, so we'll just talk about a couple of quick little tools and tricks that I've found that making responsive layouts really easy. So the first is very simple. It's literally just defining your breakpoint variables in Sass. So typically these are the 4 that you'll use, and sometimes you'll really only need small, medium, large. And then on top of that, we have these Sass responsive mixins. So I talked about mixins a little bit, but basically what it allows you to do is reuse behavior across many different classes that you define. So in this case, what it's doing is kind of simplifying the syntax of separating your breakpoints. So here, typically we'll be using this responsive mixin that I've created, and you pass in the screen size. So for instance, inside of a block of SAS code, you'll just say includes responsive, and then you'll pass in small, medium, large, extra large. And when your screen is at least that size, then the code that you put inside of this will apply. So that makes it very easy because you can just define all the classes you need, and then inside of those classes, you just use this mixin and the screen size you're targeting and define the styles that apply to that screen size. Very useful. And then for CSS Grid, one of the most useful features I've found in CSS Grid is the grid template areas. So basically what that allows you to do is define certain classes in your layout structure as template areas. And then with those template areas, you basically lay out your entire screen in a very intuitive way. So you'll see here, like this whole top part is going to be the header. We have our nav bar and our main area, and then nav bar still and footer. So that kind of breaks the screen up into these blocks. And so what we can do to create responsive layouts is utilize this, target the breakpoints that we need, and completely change our layout for each of those breakpoints using CSS Grid. So it's really powerful. And I'll kind of show some of that when we get to the demo portion. But you'll see here, they define their grid template areas, so their whole layout. And then grid template rows is going to apply to the side, the height of each row. So in this case, we're saying the header is 50 pixels. We're saying this next area is 1 FR. And so that's kind of a unique measurement. But basically what it does is it will fill the area in between and kind of it scales depending on what value you pass to it. So in this case it's 1, so, and we don't have any other FR values, so it's just gonna fill the area in between. And then our last little row here is 30 pixels. And then the columns is defining the width of each column. So for instance, here our navigation is 150 pixels wide, and then our footer, our main area, just take up the rest of the space there. So yeah, okay. So that's kind of the end of the presentation portion. And before I hop into the demo, does anyone have any questions about anything I talked about? Going once? All right, cool. So we will hop into the demo then. So I've already set up a little React app that's ready to go. So I'm just gonna pull up the code here. So at the moment, this is what our main layout looks like. So it's very simple. We just have this kind of wrapper class defined as main. I'm gonna zoom in so everyone can see it actually. If I can, yeah. Is everyone able to see this clearly?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so we have our kind of wrapper class here defined as main, and then we have our header, we have our main content, we have our sidebar, and we have our footer. So that's the that main layout there. And then, so this is what it looks like right now because we haven't defined our grid yet. So I wanted to go through that with you guys and kind of show you how that works and how defining your grid changes the layout here. So like I said, when we're building a layout, we want to start mobile first. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is go right into the mobile layout here. This is one of the Google Chrome tools I was talking about. All you have to do is go into inspect and click this toggle device toolbar. And then from here, you select whatever screen size you want. For mobile purposes, I'm just going to be using the iPhone X screen size. But you also have the option of just clicking responsive, and you can kind of drag the screen size to whatever you want and see how your layout responds. But for now, we'll stick with iPhone X. So if we go into the code here, give me a second here. All right, so we're gonna define our grid inside of main. So main, we're gonna say display grid. So that's our grid, and then we're gonna say minimum height is gonna be 100% of the view height, and we'll make that position relative. All right, and you'll see I've defined in each of these kind of sub areas, I've already defined the grid areas there. So all you have to do is kind of name your grid area, and that's what you'll use to define the grid layout. So I'm just going to take some code that I have off to the side here. See if I can fix it. Yeah. All right. So for mobile, we're not going to target any specific breakpoint because we're starting with the smallest screen size. So we just want this to be the default. And so what we're going to define is very simple. We're just going to have the header, the main, and the footer. We're ignoring the sidebar for now. Normally with like mobile or something, you'd have some kind of like pop-in sidebar. But for the purposes of this demo, we're just going to kind of ignore that and just show what it looks like without it. Okay, yeah, and so our grid template columns is just 100% of the width. And then grid template rows, we have a header height defined and a footer height defined. And then everything in between is just filling the space. And I have those defined in a variables file, as well as my breakpoints. All right, so now once we define these areas, our layout should look a bit different. Okay, so there's really no styling still on this, but you can kind of see headers up here, footers down here. And to make it clear, I'm going to add a couple styles here. So I'm just going to go into the make. All right. Let's make our main header. It's just going to have a card shadow mix in that I've created. Make the background certain color. Okay, so you can see that's our header. Okay, for our footer, we'll use this stuff. And we'll do that. So that's our footer. And so everything else in between is just the main content. So now that we've defined our mobile breakpoint, we're going to start going up in screen size and kind of define how we want it to look when we start expanding. So let's target a specific breakpoint here in main. So here we're going to do, so we're using our responsive mix-in that I showed earlier. And so we're targeting the medium breakpoint. And in this case, we want to show that side nav bar. So now we have 3 kind of columns that we're defining. The header's going to go all the way across. We're going to have the navigation on the left side, and then the rest of the main area with a specified width, and then everything else just kind of filling the rest of the space there. So we define that, and we start going up in screen size. Let's see. Wait, oh, I know what happened. I forgot a very important piece of code here. So we want to define our styles for our little main left area here so that we can actually see it. And then we also want to display it on the median breakpoint here. So we'll include another responsive thing here and tell it how to display. Okay, so now we can kind of see a sidebar, and there's some content that I have commented out here. So if we uncomment that, just a couple of nav items. And we'll go ahead and add the styles for those as well. Okay, so now you can kind of see what that looks like when we get to a medium breakpoint. So we have our sidebar, we get our header, we get our footer. So if we go back to mobile, or if we just kind of shrink this, that sidebar is going to disappear. And then, so let's say when we get to a large screen size, we actually want to move that entire nav bar up to the top. And we want it to be a top nav instead when we have enough screen space. So with CSS Grid, that's pretty easy to accomplish. We're just going to define another layout and target the large breakpoint here. And this one's super simple. We're just stacking everything on top of each other, and we're defining the heights of each of those. So if we do that, and then, so the problem here is going to be, when we get to that, our nav items are still in this flex column layout. So if we go over here, so we're telling it to display flex. This is where Flexbox comes into play here. And we're working with a one-dimensional area. And so at the moment, we're telling it to display as a column. But at the large breakpoint, we want to tell it to display in a row. So all that takes is just targeting that breakpoint and telling it to display in a row. And then that should fix our issue there. Yep. So now we have a top nav. And if we shrink this down, it's going to go back to a side nav. Switches back between those, and it took like 2 lines of code. So that just kind of displays the power of CSS Grid a little bit, as well as Flexbox. But yeah, so that's just a little demo kind of going over how you can quickly build a very basic layout pretty easily once you kind of get familiar with the syntax of CSS Grid. And that's it. So thank you. Is there any questions now that we've gone through the demo? Happy to field those.
I do have one, Javier here. So I noticed that you have the SAS code in place, but you didn't have to do anything. So I'm thinking that you have something in the background that is doing the compilation, or how do you set up that?
Okay, yeah. So in this case, I actually use Create React App. And what that does is kind of set up a React application and handles the compilation of that SAS. So in a normal project, you would have to set up a SAS compiler and either like set it up to watch the CSS and compile on its own, or run a command to compile it whenever you make changes to the SAS code. And that'll compile it down to CSS, and you'll be able to see your changes. But for the purposes of the demo, I was using Create React App, and when you run that, it compiles the SAS code right then and there. So
I see. Okay, that's really cool. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your question. Anybody else? All right, well, that's my time. If you guys have come up with any questions later, feel free to message me on Slack, or if you're running into issues with SAS or CSS problems, let me know. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, guys.
Scott.